So the first symptom that is actually being caused by your gut that you didn't even realize is brain fog. In fact, antibiotics in the medical research have been shown to actually stop these symptoms. In my experience and talking to other people, this may in fact be the best benefit, the biggest benefit of lowering the total amount of bacteria in your gut and improving your gut function. Brain fog is this sort of nondescript lack of mental clarity, focus. It's like poor cognition. Maybe your vision's a little bit blurred, and overall you're just kind of distracted. You're kind of just not there. You feel like you're in a fog. This can be driven by gut bacterial overgrowth, and this is because the bacteria in your colon can actually generate quite a bit of inflammation. And if you think about inflammation, I mean, when was the last time you were sick? You probably felt kind of crappy, low energy in general. And it's kind of the same thing going on here, but instead of a acute sort of inflammation, you're dealing with a chronic low-grade inflammation, but it still impedes your ability to generate energy, and it can cause these symptoms. There's also a compound called D-lactic acid, which can be produced from bacteria, and this is a known neurotoxin that can cause all of these symptoms, and it's been shown time and time again in the research. Number 2 is weight gain or obesity, especially if you feel like you just put on weight no matter what you're eating. There's a good chance that it could reside in your gut. And this goes hand in hand with insulin resistance. These can all actually be driven by gut problems. This can be seen in experiments where they give animals doses of endotoxin. And if you don't know, endotoxin is basically a piece of a bacteria which can drive inflammation both in the intestine, but it can also mimic something called intestinal permeability, which is essentially when the lining of your intestine becomes permeable, it becomes leaky, and things from the intestine can actually leak to the opposite side and become systemic issues. So administering animals endotoxin or increasing the amount of serotonin that's produced peripherally, again, this is something that is seen when you have gut problems. Both of these can actually induce obesity and insulin resistance. These are things that can actually lower your resting metabolic rate. So basically how many calories you burn. It's interesting because most times we don't think about something that's going on in our gut is actually affecting how much energy we're burning, but it's actually one of the prime causes of these problems. There's even a term in the research called infectobesity, which is exactly like what it sounds like. Basically, when bacteria are actually driving obesity in humans, and a lot of this is driven through the gut. Number 3 is anxiety. So actually things like probiotics, low FODMAP diets, or other interventions that can change the bacterial composition in the gut and improve gut function can actually also improve symptoms of anxiety. This is a huge one in my opinion. It's something I see all the time where people have, chronic anxiety and they really can't figure out what's going on. But at the end of the day, it just comes down to there being some kind of irritation or inflammation going on in their intestine that's creating this anxiety. This is actually a huge problem in my experience. It's very, very often where people have nondescript anxiety and they can't really figure out what's going on, but ultimately it comes down to the fact that there's some kind of irritation or inflammation going on in their intestines, which is causing this systemic problem. And there's a few key reasons why this happens. First of all, when you have gut inflammation, you will actually have a lot of serotonin. And serotonin systemically actually activates every single part of what's known as the HPA axis. So the hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal axis, which is the quintessential system of stress. And that is a key driver of anxiety because ultimately anxiety is really just a condition of chronic stress. Serotonin is also able to upregulate something called parathyroid hormone, as well as another hormone called prolactin. And these are both directly related to poor mood in general, but also anxiety. Then there's also the fact that gut irritation from serotonin in the gut can actually activate the sympathetic nervous system. So yes, the fight or flight response, so your adrenaline, that feeling when your heart is really pounding or you can't really catch your breath, that's your sympathetic nervous system. And a lot of those things are actually associated with anxiety. And it's been shown that people, when they're having panic attacks or when they have anxiety in general, tend to have higher levels of these catecholamines, so adrenaline and noradrenaline. And uncoincidentally, people with IBS also tend to have elevated catecholamines. And then in general, the systems of inflammation and stress, they always tend to kind of go hand in hand. So stress can cause inflammation and inflammation can cause stress. So this can really become a vicious cycle. And I truly believe that in most cases, targeting the gut first is going to be your biggest lever. Number 4 is fatigue. So chronic fatigue syndrome is consistently and strongly associated with elevated levels of intestinal permeability, gut bacterial toxicity, and subsequent inflammation. And again, this is because the inflammation and serotonin disrupt the mitochondria, your ability to generate energy within the cells. And of course, that can lead to fatigue. This is the type of fatigue where it pains you to even think about moving. This is the type of fatigue that no amount of sleep will ever cure. This is the type of fatigue that is absolutely debilitating and that I see so many people dealing with, and they don't realize that it can actually start in your gut. So this is actually also true of exercise-induced fatigue. So we often think about exercise-induced fatigue being from either lactic acid, or you just, you ran out of breath, or whatever the case may be. But exercise can actually acutely induce intestinal permeability, which we talked a little bit about before. And that's because exercise can divert blood flow to different areas of the body that need it at that time. But when that happens, the blood goes away from the intestines. It causes an acute amount of intestinal permeability. And then you can have all types of components coming in from the gut to systemic circulation, which is causing impaired energy production, inflammation, all of those things that we've talked about. So if you're the type of person that can't tolerate even like a little bit of exercise, you just burn out super quickly or get tired when other people are like, yo, what is like wrong with you? It could be actually starting in your gut. Okay, so number 5 is allergies. This definitely starts in the gut. Overprescription of antibiotics in childhood actually disturbs the gut development and function through a number of different mechanisms. And this has been such a big problem over the last probably 50 years because we've started giving children tons and tons of antibiotics when they're very, very young and susceptible to infection, which has prevented a lot of deaths, but it's also consequently altered a lot of people's gut function going forward. And that has been consistently associated with the risk of developing allergies. So if you look over the last 50 years, there's been a lot more allergies than normal. And a big part of this is because 70% of your immune system actually resides in your gut, and that includes the mast cells. There's tons of mast cells in your gut, and these mast cells are best known for secreting histamine. So if you take something like Claritin or Zyrtec for your allergies, well, what that's doing is it's blocking that histamine, and a lot of that can actually originate in the gut. Okay, so number 6, this is low testosterone. This is a big one. This one doesn't get talked about a lot as being gut-centric, but it definitely can be. So actually, if you infuse male participants, and I wouldn't want to be one of these guys, but if you infuse male participants acutely with that endotoxin, so that piece of a bacteria, which is essentially mimicking having lots of bacteria and inflammation in your gut, if you give that to men, it acutely slashes their production of their androgens. So for the boys, if your voice becomes lighter or you become less assertive, your gym performance goes down, your muscularity declines, your strength declines, you have low motivation, you have poor libido, or you don't have morning wood, things like that, it can definitely originate in your gut. And I see this actually a lot where guys can't seem to figure out what's going on. They're like, oh, I'm lifting and I feel like I'm eating clean and I'm doing all these things, but my testosterone is like in the 300s. And a lot of times it can actually be driven by gut irritation. But that does not exclude women either, because women need testosterone for libido. A lot of women nowadays, unfortunately, suffer with like estrogenic overload, and testosterone helps to balance that out. It's also very important for both sexes in terms of cognition. So if any of this sounds like you, whether you're a guy or a girl, you could have low testosterone. It could, in fact, be driven by your gut. And in fact, markers of intestinal permeability actually correlate with low T directly, as well as markers of inflammation, of course. So when things become inflamed in the gut, they always become inflamed systemically. And when that happens, all of your systems start to shut down. So it's your brain, it's your liver, it's your muscles, and it's definitely your gonads. Number 7, this is another very, very common one. Number 7 is poor sleep. Again, antibiotics have been shown to actually help people with poor sleep very rapidly. And it pains me to see people spending tons of money on magnesium, blue light blockers. They're listening to different frequencies. They're doing different nighttime routines to get better sleep. And I'm not saying that those things don't have value, but a lot of times you wouldn't need any of that if you actually addressed your gut irritation. So this is something you can definitely experience and relate to, really. I mean, because if you think about it, like, when was the last time you had a stomach bug or something? You definitely couldn't like fall asleep, right? Well, if you have a low level of that going on all the time, you might be able to sleep, but you might just not feel rested. You might wake up during the night. You might need to go and urinate. You might wake up and you'd be very thirsty. All of those things can actually be driven by irritation in the gut. And again, this is because the bacterial overgrowth or the dysbiosis, and that can irritate the lining of the intestine, which triggers inflammation. That can stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, and that can definitely wake you up in the middle of the night. It can cause you to wake up and have that heart pounding or that, oh my God, I'm breathing really heavy, and just an unpleasant overall experience. So if you have any of these symptoms, or you just have an overt gut problem, or if you just want any sort of help personally optimizing your health and energy and your metabolism, then you should definitely check out Prism. We have a whole team of practitioners, and we all work together to help out our clients with various different issues, especially gut issues, because it's so systemic to everything. But yeah, if you're interested in getting some personalized help, I would definitely go check out Prism. You can click the top right of your screen here, or the link will be in the description. So definitely go check that out if this sounds like you and you want some personal help. Okay, number 8. Skin issues. There's a lot of different skin issues that start in the gut. These are incredibly common, and the gut and the skin are always linked in the research. There's this whole gut-skin axis that's talked about in the research, and it's because they're always influencing each other. But most of the time, the gut is influencing the skin. So the first skin condition that has been consistently associated with gut problems is psoriasis. This is linked to increased intestinal permeability, and it's also directly tied the symptoms of digestive discomfort. So like reflux, abdominal pain, and even diarrhea. These are all directly correlated with psoriasis. So the next skin condition is eczema or dry skin. And I actually had someone message me on Twitter the other day saying that their chronic eczema actually went away completely within a week of using glutamine. And if you guys haven't seen our video on glutamine, I would definitely check it out. It's a very powerful and cheap tool that you can use to help alleviate a lot of these issues, especially that intestinal permeability and inflammation. So studies have actually shown that people with these conditions have higher rates of intestinal permeability. So there's a pretty clear link right there. Another big one is acne. And there's a reason that acne is often treated with antibiotics. And I understand that a lot of the antibiotics work systemically, but a lot of them also have a lot of their key mechanisms of action by working in the gut and correcting some of these bacterial overgrowths. And again, this often goes hand in hand with intestinal permeability and bacterial overgrowth. I'm sounding like a broken record now, but it really is such a pervasive issue in everything. And then finally, another big skin condition that most people don't really think of as a skin condition, but dandruff. So dandruff, just like dry skin, is clearly linked to the gut. And it's actually been successfully treated in certain circumstances with probiotics that can actually counteract a lot of this dysbiosis or bacterial overgrowth. So there's a pretty clear link right there. Okay, so number 9 is depression. Yes, even depression, very poor chronic depression. This is definitely associated with the gut, and it's something that I think a lot of people might underestimate because we often think of depression as being this problem in the brain. And obviously that's true in a lot of cases, but a lot of times it can boil down to an issue in the gut. So one study showed that people that were depressed had every marker of dysbiosis and intestinal inflammation elevated. That means that everything that they tested to see if they had gut problems, they had. So in my experience, even personally, this is one of the clearest one-to-one correlations that I've seen, like personally with myself, but also with clients that we work with. And this is a lot because stress and inflammation are consistently tied with depression. And obviously we talked about before how the gut can increase your levels of inflammation and stress. And both of these things are consistently associated with and known to drive depressed mood because it's not just localized to your gut. If you're inflamed in the gut, it's a systemic problem, and the same thing goes for your stress. Another big issue here that I touched on briefly earlier is serotonin. So serotonin in the gut, when it's produced in excess, not only contributes directly to a lot of the symptoms of gut problems, so like nausea or bloating or constipation or diarrhea, but it also has this systemic effect where it actually tends to shut down the amount of energy that you're producing. And this property of serotonin is actually strategically introduced in animals that hibernate in order to lower their core body temperature and lower their energy expenditure so that they can make it through the winter. But if you're a human being in modern society, you don't want to be in this weird state of pseudo hibernation. In fact, that's probably more often associated with depression. To go along with that, serotonin tends to put the brakes on dopamine sort of at every level. It kind of stops your brain from being able to produce dopamine. And if you know anything about dopamine, it's all about pleasure, it's all about motivation. So serotonin is pretty much the antithesis of that, and it completely opposes the synthesis of dopamine in the brain and systemically. And going along with that, other signs of low motivation can also be traced back, or low dopamine can also be traced back to the gut. So constipation is actually one of the best known predictors of Parkinson's disease. And the reason I'm bringing up Parkinson's disease is because it's actually characterized by a deficit of dopamine in the brain. So it's interesting to see that it can actually start in the gut from something that most people don't even think about as being this long-term problem in constipation. Poor gut health, and again, systemic inflammation, it's a systemic problem, and it can definitely put the brakes on your dopamine system independently even of serotonin in the brain. This is a huge problem. Okay, number 10 is chronic nasal congestion or mucus. And this is a very interesting one that people don't seem to often think about. But if you constantly have like this like wet cough, or you constantly feel like you have a stuffy nose, it can definitely be from your gut. In fact, people with this chronic nasal congestion had a 17-fold risk of developing irritable bowel syndrome down the line. Both of these conditions are actually rooted in bacterial-driven inflammation and intestinal permeability, once again. Number 11 is ADHD, and this is also characterized by a dopamine sort of dysfunction. So everything that I said about Parkinson's and depression in terms of serotonin and dopamine and inflammation, that all still applies. But even independently of that, people with ADHD tend to have markers of intestinal permeability, and it's actually this permeability from the intestine that tends to predict its symptoms. Okay, and number 12, and you're not really gonna believe this one, but is actually hair loss. So there was one remarkable report of someone getting a fecal transplant, which is basically, as weird as it sounds, getting someone's fecal material and transplanting it to another individual. And this can actually have some pretty cool gut protective effects by reducing inflammation and changing the bacterial composition. But this actually restored hair growth in 2 individuals who they thought were never gonna grow their hair back. And again, this is because the inflammation, the systemic inflammation that is driven from the intestine, can impair the growth of the hair follicle. Hair and skin are very energy intensive tissues because they're constantly turning over, they're constantly growing, and they constantly need this supply of energy. And when you have a problem going on in your gut that tends to inhibit energy metabolism systemically, well, it's not really a coincidence that you'll end up with hair and skin problems, among other things. And with that, I conclude my list, and I hope the moral of the story here is that the gut is really the center of your overall health. It's so critical to focus on first, and if you don't focus on that, then you can get yourself in a situation where you're trying different diets and different supplements and different exercise routines, but nothing seems to really be actually getting to the root cause of your problems. I see that so often where people are looking in the wrong place. Maybe they're thinking that they need something for their brain or for their muscles, or they need to lose weight first. But in actuality, the core of all their problems is actually in their gut. And again, I would just like to say that if you want any help with these kinds of things, definitely go check out Prism. I work with all of these different practitioners, and it's really beautiful what we're building there. And we're already seeing some major change with our clients. So it's really exciting, and I really think that we can help you guys out if you're looking for something personal. So definitely go check that out. And yeah, with all that being said, don't let them fool you. Subscribe, and yeah, have a good day.